Josh, is that Josh Gorfinkel? I don't know.
No, hi, it's Rafi Blumenthal's brother, Josh.
Oh, hi,
Also
Josh.
Blumenthal.
That's right. I remember meeting you at the film club.
Yes, a while ago.
Which movie was that again? Was it
Which did Rafi present?
did he do anything? The Way to the Forum?
A funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Yes,
It was that one. Yeah.
one of our old favorites. That's right. Yes. Wow. Very, very good memory, Professor.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get started. Let me share the screen. See if it works better this time. Oh, we had that same problem last time, didn't we, Leah?
Yeah. Maybe
Okay.
if you
So I'm going to download it and do
Yeah.
it from my computer.
yeah.
So I'm going to stop the share. I have to reload it. I remember this happening last time. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Now I can download it. Okay, we have that. It's on my computer now. Okay. Now I could share. Okay, so you're seeing it actually?
Yes.
Good. But I'm curious when you other people have to be on Zoom and you need to share and things aren't going right, do you talk out loud as you go through the steps just to let people know that you're still there and that you're actually doing something?
I think a lot of people do, honestly.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I'm doing. So I just have to go now as I'm still talking.
It's called vamping.
Is that what it's called? Really? I don't believe you. Okay, play from current slide. Modest proposals, but not meant in jest, unlike Swift. That's a reference to his famous modest proposals about one of the Irish famines. Okay, so here's my plan today. I'm gonna just go over a few other court cases, which I think are examples, and I could have so many of them they could take up the rest of the hour of the court run amok. Amok, I think, by the way, just to give you a little bit of trivia, is possibly a unique American English etymology. It may very well be the only word derived from one of the Filipino languages that we have in our own vocabulary. But the court run amok is the way I describe some of these decisions, which get back to the argument of why I think judicial review is a bad idea. So remember this one from 1995, because I used to bring it up in class somewhat obsessively for a few years thereafter. I thought it was particularly ironic. The issue concerned the school district in Kansas City, Missouri, rather than in Kansas itself. And there were lawsuits dating back, I believe, as long ago as the 1970s, that there was inequitable funding for the school districts there, underfunding that was making the state constitutional right of equal education a mockery. And the citizens of the underfunded school district sued. The case eventually went to the United States Supreme Court because the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that the schools needed to provide equal funding, which is fine. But in doing so, the courts eventually took the position where they ordered the districts that were underfunding to raise their taxes in order to pay better salaries for teachers, among other things. And the idea being that the higher salaries would attract better teachers, and the better teachers would then equalize the education, at least go a long way to equalizing the education. And the case rose to the Supreme Court, which came up with a somewhat nuanced ruling in a way. They said that while you can have a court rule, in this case, that you can have equal funding, you can't have the court actually order the tax increases. But they said if there was in this particular case, they claimed that that this was not permissible actually. But they then qualified this by saying that if there was a constitutional justification, they did have the authority to order the tax increases. To hold otherwise would fail to take account of the obligations of local governments under the Supremacy Clause. That means the Constitution is supreme, to fulfill the requirements that the Constitution imposes on them. So why did I find this to be a particularly outrageous decision? Because the origins of our country go back in large part to a major political argument over whether or not a body, a governmental body, can impose taxes without representation. And I found it so deliciously ironic that we had come to a point with judicial review that our most undemocratic branch, our least representative body, there's no way anybody could claim that the Supreme Court is representative of the people's will at the time that it's making rulings. The Supreme Court in this case was agreeing to the doctrine that there could be cases in which courts, unelected courts, courts without representation could impose taxes on the people. And I thought that that was really an example of where judicial review had ultimately left us and where it was bound to ultimately leave us. Then there's many of the outcomes of this particular doctrine, which dates back to the earlier part of the previous century, the 1920s, the Silverthorne lumber case, which was then followed by, do I have it here? I don't think I put it on another slide, a subsequent case in the 1930s where the actual phrase comes from. The Silverthorne case concerned documents that were seized from the Silverthorne Lumber Company. I think there were issues of fraud, or at least fraud, some sort of illicit practices, bookkeeping practices, accounting practices that the company was following to underpay taxes. The documents were copied, and the copied documents were then used as evidence in court. And the seizure was something which had not been done in a proper manner with due process. So in other words, the original documents had been seized illegally. And the exclusionary rule was expanded here that the copied documents could not be used as evidence in the courts. And the subsequent court case in which had to do with, in that case, I'm trying to remember what it was. But for the moment I'm blanking, but a similar issue of, it was a wiretapping case. The wiretapping was a warrantless wiretapping, and the transcripts from the wiretapping were not permitted to be used in court. The idea being that Frankfurter's remark was that this was the evidence was the fruit of a poisonous tree, and therefore the fruit itself was in effect poisonous and something that could not be used in court. And there are many people who probably think that that's a reasonable thing. After all, if something's seized illegally, in effect, it should not exist, should not have a kind of legal existence that can be used in court. But I'm going to talk about some various outcomes of this type of thinking. But there are alternatives that one could adopt, and which many countries, particularly Great Britain, the United Kingdom, does adopt. And that is that in the case where you have evidence that has been illegally obtained, you could use the evidence, but punish the perpetrator. And I think of the example, because after all, if we're talking about tax documents and maybe some sort of illegal but not extraordinarily dangerous activity in which wiretapping has taken place, you could say, what's the big deal? You know, if we follow procedures, it's not such a terrible damage to society if the person is allowed to go free. But I think of an extreme case in which the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine could be thought of, and that's the issue of supposing there is some weapon of mass destruction. This is a kind of movie script that I think we probably have seen in one movie or another. A weapon of mass destruction, you've got the bad guy who has knowledge of where that weapon of mass destruction is. What do? Do you torture the person if needs be to find out where it is? Do you look the other way and pretend that torture is not something which is presumably illegal? Or do you not torture the person and let the weapon of mass destruction go off? And it seems to me that the proper answer is torture, punish the torturer, and find the weapon of mass destruction. And in that case, you're still upholding the rule of law. You can even find mitigating circumstances. If somebody has done something illegal, you could maybe have a more lenient sentence if they've broken the law, the procedural laws. But at the very least, don't throw out the evidence. And my favorite story about this has to do with a Westchester series of mass serial murders that were taking place, in which the police began to feel that they were honing in on the criminal, and they got a search warrant for the suspect's apartment. They searched the suspect's apartment, and in the course of the search of the suspect's apartment, they discovered trophies from these serial murderers in the room of the roommate of the person who was renting the apartment. And they had gotten a search warrant for the person who rented the apartment. And at least initially, the courts actually threw out the evidence because they did not have a right to search the room of the roommate. And I think that's a good example of how, in the interests of rights, and in this case, suspect or criminal rights, the courts are engaging in review and interpretation, which really defies logic as far as I'm concerned, and reasonableness. So where did that lead? To some very widely known decisions, which really extend privileges and rights that I think unbalance the criminal justice system. Miranda being one of the most famous of these. And Miranda, of course, is something that everybody's heard of. You watch any police procedural, Law and Order, for example, and we probably almost all know it by heart. And here's a quote from the testimony of the officers by the admission of respondent. It is clear that Miranda, the plaintiff who brought the suit, was not in any way apprised of his right to consult with an attorney and to have one present during the interrogation, nor was his right not to be compelled to incriminate himself effectively protected in any other manner. Without these warnings, the statements were inadmissible. The mere fact that he signed such a statement, which contained a typed-in clause stating that he had full knowledge, does not approach the knowing and intelligent waiver required to relinquish constitutional rights. So what's my problem with this? I think that there's a limit to how much, Alex, I think you're here today, aren't you?
I'm here. I'm not sure. I'm here. I'm not sure you want to get me started on this one.
So, because we were talking about libertarian positions, I think there's a point at which society does not owe an individual the extra care not to be stupid. I know people are raised under different circumstances, different capacities, but the imbalance that's created when you give somebody a pause, a warning, a chance to rethink something, I think, and I'm not the biggest fan of the police forces of this country, but I think that it's an unnecessary burden that's being placed on the policing forces. There is a moment which may be lost if you have to read these warnings. There's an even further moment that may be lost when a person, as a result of these warnings, says, wait, I'm not going to say anything until a lawyer is called in. Let the person come up with that answer beforehand. Don't make the police be burdened with having to give the person the extra edge in this particular case. And there's nothing in the language of the Constitution that says that people have to be protected from their own stupidity, from their own ignorance, from their own, at that point, fear, panic, whatever it may be. It's an example of where the courts were stepping in with interpretations that ultimately were in no way required by the language or even suggested by the language of the Constitution. And my problem is not just simply that I think it damaged the criminal justice system. My problem is that it also created this living room liberal meme that the elite courts, who rarely have to deal with the day-to-day problems of crime, insecurity because of crime, were giving an edge to criminals that were damaging society at a time when the United States was beginning to experience a wave of crime, a surge of crime, for reasons that people are still trying to figure out. But the court's ruling certainly did not help in creating a satisfied citizenry, which felt that they were being really unjustly treated by this elitist court. Don't know why those slides are there. Repeat slides. All right. So those are just, a few of the examples that, I wanted to talk about. The court, I think, since then has gone even further off the rails. The treatment of corporations, which has long been a part of our established justice system as persons, now give corporations, like in Citizens United, additional rights about free speech, which I don't think were in any way suggested by prior judicial decisions, earlier judicial decisions, and certainly I don't think were intended by those who authored the Bill of Rights, let alone the Constitution. So, what are my modest proposals for all this? Well, actually, you know what? I actually want to pause for a moment and see what anybody thinks about these particular decisions. And Alex, I do want to get you started. So you're going to go first.
Great. Well, then it makes it easy for me to say, I think was probably unfairly unpopular, which is something along the lines of what Hugo Black said in dissent in one of these cases. I think it was Wolf, but he basically says about the idea of the concept of the fruit of the poisonous tree, or the exclusionary rule in general, that that has nothing to do with the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. It's just a judicially created rule of evidence. And that's what you see in a lot of this activism. Is Missouri v. Jenkins is a good one as well. Justice Thomas has an excellent concurrence there, where he basically says, look, this is all we're doing here, right? Is we're taking the position that the judiciary has unfettered authority to fashion whatever kind of remedy it wants for any kind of problem that it perceives, not necessarily constitutionally speaking, but within society at large. And yeah, that's where we are. That's where we started. It's gotten worse, as I'm sure you'll expand upon. But this is, I think, as we've discussed, this is counter what the court has been doing for half a century or more. Runs counter to the constitutional libertarian ideals that I think the founders had in mind, and it's certainly not the role that I think they imagined the judiciary was going to play.
Any other comments? We have two people taking more or less a similar position here. I wonder if Dan Reich is here today.
I am.
Dan, what do you think about the criminal rights decisions?
Well, I don't have the same difficulties that you do, for example, with Miranda. But, I commented from a different perspective. So, I mean, on that, and I think, here we just come to what does it mean to have the right to counsel? What, I mean, and you kind of know the liberal position there. And the idea is essentially in order to have the right to counsel, one does have to be protected from one's own stupidity. I mean, that's kind of the fundamental concept there. So I don't necessarily buy the argument that, if someone's stupid, they should suffer from their own stupidity, and that's it. Sorry, my dinner is just arriving, so I need to. But I wanted to come back to the more fundamental point that I think it was Alex just made on libertarianism. And well, first reaction to that is, I'm not sure the Constitution is intended to reflect a libertarian worldview. That's an assumption that I would take issue with. And second, even if it did, we live in a very, very, very different world with a federal government that's very differently situated than the one that was envisioned. And so, I take, and this is my problem with originalism and the whole approach of the conservative wing of the court, because I don't buy this. I mean, to me, it's nonsense. First of all, I don't buy the idea that, the way to interpret the Constitution is to try to get it an originalist interpretation. And B, I think that the originalism that they purport to engage in today is hogwash. I mean, it's a lot of ex post views of what was intended that are not actually tied to historical reality. So, well, Ben
Laywell may partially guess what's coming next, which is that I think one of the best books written about the intentions of the Constitution, the constitutional authors, or at least the ones who were most responsible for writing the Constitution, is written by, I can call him a friend of yours, Ben, Eric
Nelson?
Yeah.
You could call him a friend.
Okay, good. Eric Nelson, who wrote The Royalist Revolution, who certainly does not present the Constitution as a libertarian document, but one which was trying to establish a kind of royalist system without a king, a reinstitution of some degree of central authority. So, Dan, I agree with you that it's certainly not a libertarian document. I think the trouble I have with the idea of interpreting in a way that's not based upon originalism is, what's the standard then? And I think ultimately the standard then becomes one's own personal position. Now, of course, I don't really believe in interpreting on the basis of originalism either, because I think the point I've been making this whole time is any interpretation of the Constitution is something which we ought not to be engaged in at all. Certainly not in terms of the courts, and certainly not in terms of guiding us about what laws we may or may not have. So if we have to have interpretation, I would say originalism is the only logical way of doing it. But on the other hand, it's not a very good idea to begin with. It's just enslaving us to our ancestors and their attitudes at that time, and we wouldn't want that. Anyone, can make a further comment before I move on, just in terms of what just came up. So let's go now.
I take issue with the idea that the originalist approach is the best. I think it's inevitable. I mean, there's no choice but to interpret the Constitution, and I don't think that an originalist approach works, because it's the only reason that the Constitution continues to be effective is because it's an evolving document that has been adapted to a very dynamically changing political reality, and certainly one that's changed radically in the last 100 years. And the only way that happens is and the only way that there's been room for the country to evolve the way it has been to depart from kind of what's probably the original intention of the founders. I mean,
right. To which I would say, then why have it? Why have it as our reference point at all? I mean, there is that alternative of doing away with any interpretation whatsoever. It is a real possibility. I'm not saying it's a realizable possibility, but it does exist as an alternative.
Sorry, someone's knocking on my door. I'll be right back. Apologies.
Okay. So let me go into what I'm really dealing with in that little exchange with Dan, and come back to what our constitutional interpretation is ultimately based on. And I think it's based upon the Enlightenment noble lie that has taken hold of our society and many modern societies. And many of you will know that the noble lie is something that elites create, particularly in Plato's example, the lie of religion, in order to maintain society as a stable entity, in order to keep people, in effect, in line. And the noble lie that we live by, or one of the noble lies that we live by, is this notion of rights. And the rights revolution of the 18th and 19th century, which has continued to this day, is, I think, at the core of judicial review and so many of the problems in our society. So let's go back to the origins of this noble lie, at least in terms of modern times. John Locke's, Ben, I think I remember actually drawing this particular sort of almost like a Venn diagram when you were in 10th grade and we were doing the Enlightenment. But John Locke's idea of the state of nature and why we don't live in a state of nature. So Locke probably recognized that the idea of a state of nature was itself just a thought experiment. Whether it really existed at one point in human history or not was not important. Locke was, like Hobbes before him, trying to imagine what's the role of government, what's the purpose of government, why do we live in civil society? And he starts by imagining humans living in a state of nature, possessing two qualities: their right to life and their right to be free, because that's what a state of nature is. They live and they're free. And in that state of nature, they seize hold of certain pieces of earth, certain tools are made out of it, certain improvements are made out of it. And Locke described this as imparting, in effect, a portion of their life and liberty into that object that they have now improved upon. It's no longer just natural existence, that tool, that item, that house, that improved property. And as a result, because it contains, in effect, a part of their life and liberty, it is endowed with the rights that they have to life and liberty. And therefore, that piece of property is something that they have a right to. It's theirs because they have imparted their life and liberty to it. So why do humans leave the state of nature where they have this right to life, liberty, and property? Because it's endangered by the occasional errant human being who is going to try to impose upon them, kill them, enslave them, steal from them. And so humans get together and they form civil society, and government then exists to protect their life, liberty, and property. And in effect, this diagram is a depiction of Locke's idea of what society is like. You have the sovereign government, whether it's a king or whether it's a democratically elected republic, whatever it may be. And the sovereign republic is there to protect all those individuals who have the right to life, liberty, and property. But the problem is that there's a kind of inherent contradiction in that, because each one of these human beings, in effect, is in their own capacity kind of carving out this free space which is them in their state of nature within this supposed sovereign civil society. And in the areas where these humans possess rights, the right to, for example, freedom of religion, or the right, if you want to interpret it as such, to engage in a civil marriage, to be married, or the right to use your property the way you want. In that capacity, you may impinge upon somebody else's right. So, for example, this person here, if you can see the little cursor moving around, this person here may have a deep Christian belief which says that they don't want to serve somebody who is gay. And this gay person here has the right to be gay and wants to be served. And so in their state of nature, they have the absolute right to realize these goals, to behave in that way. So how can you possibly have these people free to exercise those rights and at the same time live in civil society? Well, you have to have a sovereign who is going to adjudicate between that. But once they're adjudicating between that, they're going to be making modifications, choices, restrictions. They may say that this trumps that person's right, or they may say that both these rights. I expect somebody to try to argue with me on this. A right that's modified is no longer a right. You can call it maybe a privilege which has certain limits, but it seems to me that there's no such thing as a right which can be limited, restricted. It's no longer freedom. It's civil society imposing its rules upon you. So I think there's an essential problem with Locke's view about society in which we still retain these supposed rights. And it should come as no surprise that I prefer Hobbes's view insofar as I have to choose between the two, because Hobbes viewed a state of nature not as a place in which we have any rights whatsoever. Hobbes viewed a state of nature in which we're just simply selfish, power-seeking individuals. We all want power. And because we all want power, we're all threatened by everybody else who wants power. And we come to recognize that our grasp for power in a state of nature is one in which most of us, I would be one of them, who would live a life that's nasty, brutish, ugly, coarse, and very, very short. I wouldn't last very long. And so people like myself, recognizing the dangers of living in a state of nature, all of us seeking power selfishly, come together in order to form a sovereign civil society in which we give up our attempt to gain power to a sovereign, and we have no rights vis-a-vis each other. We just simply have the right to serve the sovereign who decides what privileges we have. And the fact is that in civil society, according to Hobbes, when we give up our state of nature, that's when we gain rights. rights to the sovereign, if he so wishes, to protect our life, liberty, and property. And the sovereign, whether it's a democratically elected one or an absolute monarch, gets to decide what the limits of those privileges, those rights may be. So those are two views of the state of nature and of rights. But I would like to get rid of the idea of rights whatsoever, because we never actually lived in a state of nature. Our antecedents, whatever they were, whatever ape-like creature they were, lived in a society. Every human being is born into a society. We're all obligated to each other. And the idea that we have some absolute right to something is simply a lie, however noble it may seem. So what difference does it make whether or not we live by this lie or not? I think the difference is because it affects the way we interact with each other, and it affects the way we structure our government and our lawmaking. And let me illustrate that with the next slide. Hold on. I think it leads us to ask the wrong questions. Whenever we try to make laws, it seems to me that we always start with the question of what right of mine is being violated and how could we redress that wrong? So, for example, the issue of African Americans and schooling and segregation, the question that was being asked often was, in fact, almost always was, is some inherent right being violated? And I think the real thing that we should be asking is, what is the problem that exists that needs to be solved? And the problem may be, is somebody getting a good education? Is somebody leading a life in which they have an opportunity to develop their talents? There are many, many things that we may say. Take gun issues, for example, and the recent tragedy that occurred down in Nashville, excuse me, where we can ask the question, do we really want to live in a society in which we have these mass gun killings that are taking place? That's the problem that needs to be solved. The problem isn't, is someone's right being violated? Is someone's right to, it changes the way we think about lawmaking if we get away from rights. Once we start attacking it from a problem point of view rather than a gun point of view, it forces us to ask questions about, what do we really want from government? What do we really want from living together? What problems do we see? What proposals can we make to redress those problems? Do we have investigations, research, which suggests how those problems can be solved? Let's craft a law which we think will attack those problems. Let's see how the law works. If the law doesn't work, if it doesn't lead to the results we want, let's change the law. It's a much more effective way of thinking about government and about our role in civil society. But instead, we get into these constant arguments about rights, the recent mask issue, vaccination issue. It always boiled down, it seems, to, were my rights to stay healthy being violated? Were your rights to being free not to wear a mask being violated? The essential questions, I think, were obviously, do we really want to live in a society, in a country in which we're spreading disease around? And the answer may be, maybe we do. But if it's not, then we could begin to attack the problems without always going back to the issue of rights. And here's where, Alex, I think you and I probably have our most fundamental disagreement. The rights revolution has created this libertarian attitude, which I think is antithetical to living in society. I don't think it's beneficial. I don't think it's a healthy way of living. I think we should be living with a constant notion of our obligations to each other and what our laws are meant to be doing as far as making sure that we take care of each other. And the libertarian position, which is something which is been spread by conservatives and liberals alike is something which I think has gotten out of hand, and judicial review has played a large role in accomplishing that, I think, dangerous result. So what can we do about judicial review? And these are some of the suggestions. We could just get rid of it entirely. I don't think that's happening. We could pack the courts, but the problem with packing the courts is he who packs today gets packed tomorrow when another party takes over. You could constantly have a battle of packing. I think the best proposals that I've seen have been this one, which is just ignore the courts. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's part of our political culture at this point, but it's certainly something which has a longstanding constitutional tradition dating back to Jackson, to some extent Abraham Lincoln, and certainly to Thomas Jefferson. That is, when the courts make a ruling, it doesn't mean you in your own capacity have to go along with that ruling. The executive branch could ignore it and carry out the original law if the courts have overruled it and canceled it. There's nothing in the Constitution which says that the court has the final say. Another possibility is, and this one has really an even more, I think, strong argument in favor of it in terms of the constitutional language, is that the legislature, when it passes a law or could make it as part of a law, restricting the areas where the court is entitled to engage in judicial review and even hearing a case. The clause in the Constitution that says that Congress may alter the appellate jurisdiction of the courts gives Congress the power to say this area of lawmaking is not going to be subject to appeal to the Supreme Court or to the National Judiciary. And in that case, then the court simply wouldn't be able to hear such a case. So I think those are two of the most effective proposals that I've heard. Of course, I'd like to get rid of judicial review entirely, but I know that that's something which is not likely to happen until something as outrageous as Dred Scott, and maybe not even that, occurs again. So now I'm going to throw it out to all of you for comment, argument, and healthy disagreement. Ben, I know you well.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is really not something that I have any professional background in, but what I'd be interested in hearing is, what would be sort of, if you could go back in time and sort of, if you could somehow control the Warren Court. I took a college course where it was very much in support of the expansion of rights and of judicial activism during Warren's tenure. And we went one by one, starting with Brown, and then I think overturning Schenck, which was these anti-communist laws. Right. And then suddenly a right to privacy appeared magically in the Constitution, and search and seizure, right? So Miranda, right? So it went on and on. I guess you made the point that, well, the exclusionary rule has problems. You imagine the 24 episode, and most people would not want evidence thrown out. But how would you have allowed for this to develop, desegregation in the South in the 1950s, without this kind of activism and in the way that they went ahead?
Well, there was another type of activism that was taking place, of course, the activism on the streets in terms of the civil rights movement, which was meant to be acting to a larger extent on the legislatures and on Congress than on the courts. Obviously, when we play what if history, we don't know what if would have led to. But I think And my parents would be so outraged if they could hear me say this, because Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a popular name in our family dinner table. I think because you seem to remember everything that I've ever said, and you may remember that around the dinner table as a little 5-year-old, I would happily say, in response to some question like, did you hear that? My mother might ask my father, did you hear about Eisenhower's press conference today? And I would pipe in and say, yes. And he had terrible syntax. And it wasn't until I think I was in my 30s that I actually learned what syntax was, but I knew Eisenhower had terrible syntax. Ultimately, the courts cannot impose cultural and social changes on people. That time needs to do that. And one might say, but hasn't the court decisions or decisions regarding civil rights played a large role in changing people's attitudes about racial differences and created a greater degree of tolerance in this country? So I'd actually like to see some good, careful studies of that done, because it seems to me, unless I'm missing something from recent times, we still have a racial prejudice problem in this country. And in many ways, it doesn't show really signs of going away. And I'm wondering whether or not we might have had a greater opportunity to overcome racial prejudices and intolerance if we had allowed the popular will to affect change rather than the courts. Maybe the solution to poor schooling, and this came up actually in the last session, might have been, Alex, I think maybe it was you who brought that up. It might have been better if we had focused on creating better schooling, really equal schooling for all of our citizens. There are lots of things that are wrong with our educational system in terms of its funding. The fact that we base it on local property values to a large extent, and so on and so forth. So if we had gone that direction of actually improving the schooling, maybe instead of focusing on the issue of desegregation itself, perhaps that might have been a better pathway. Certainly that's in terms of, because taking a position against Brown v. Topeka Board of Ed is really going out on a limb here. So I'm trying to take the one might see as the least easy target, and saying that even that may not have been for the best in terms of social peace in our country and evolution of attitudes, which I think we all agree needed evolving. As far as the criminal protections, as it is, the courts, and that gets back to this issue of rights, you create an absolute right to the Miranda warning, and then life intervenes and you discover, there are certain circumstances in which the Miranda warning is completely absurd. In mock trial, we had, for example, cases in which you have somebody who packed, or not packed a gun, but maybe hid some drugs near an area where there are school children around. Can you question that guy without giving them the Miranda warning and a time to pause? And of course, the courts have modified it a great deal. So perhaps we would have been better off if we didn't create these absolute rules by court fiat to begin with. And this gets back to, in part, the living room liberal issue. The rulings the courts made about things like school busing, school taxes, criminal rights, so on and so forth, have generated such a degree of dismay on the part of many of our, average income citizens, that it's generated not social peace and social stability, but the virulent culture wars that we've had. I think it would have been better if we didn't have the courts having jump-started these things. comment? That's my what if.
Yeah,
Um,
oh, go ahead.
Danny,
I want to react to the specific of Brown v. Board of Ed and its progeny, and then come back to the more fundamental point you're making about judicial review and proposals for what to do. So, I mean, on the issue of race and Brown v. Board of Ed, your alternative reality is essentially to let essentially fight it out on the streets, and that's exactly what the courts are intended to avoid, right? It's we're taking the I mean, you're kind of proposing a situation in which the issue of race and segregation and desegregation, rather than being ultimately adjudicated by courts and given effect by government power, sovereign power, the reality I hear you propose is let's let society fight it out. And that is, I mean, and that essentially leaves us in the Second Civil War. I mean, so I don't know how in the theoretical construct I understand, but the reality is, if you don't have courts stepping in and you don't have governments giving effect to the court's decisions, which have to come out one way or the other, I think you end up in a state of civil war. I don't really see how that works better. So, but
I
that,
didn't mean fight it out in that way, but it might lead to that. You're right. But I meant legislatively.
yeah, well, I mean, so maybe we come back to it. I wanted to come back to the more fundamental point, though, because that's what I really wanted to comment on, which is the idea that we shouldn't have judicial review, and what we can do about the realities that we have, and also coming back to the point you made about this concept of, like, maybe we're too focused on rights and we should focus on problems. And I think we have to, we talk so much about constitutional issues, right? But the reality is the vast majority of court cases and government action is statutory, right? And the statutes are meant to address problems. They do exactly that. They take certain problems, they try to address them. And we have certain contours and constraints to what can happen by statute and by legislation. And so we're really, when we talk about rights, I think what we're talking about is what are the outer limits, what are the boundaries of government action, what is allowed and not allowed. And that's where we come to the issue of judicial review, because we have a very complex and rich statutory system. I mean, living in New York, you become very familiar with the SEC regulations, which are a whole, or take the tax code. I mean, if there's one thing that is not even, it doesn't often raise that many constitutional issues, but raises many statutory interpretation issues and is constantly being revised and redone. It's the tax code, and that's the part of legislation that affects each and every citizen. And affects their behavior probably more than any other statutory scheme, and it's very much addressed to trying to think about certain problems and how to influence the way that they play out, including climate change, for example, and whether or not we're going to buy electric cars, or many micro decisions that we each make. So I think there is an element of what you're talking about in terms of looking at problems, trying to come up with solutions to them, but there still are boundaries. There still are questions, even with tax code, for example. Can you have a tax code that treats women differently than men? Well, Judith Ginsburg argued that no, you couldn't. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I'm sorry. And so, I think that's a correct argument. And I think there is a need to have some constraints to that, and that's where we come to the issue of rights. And I think the issue to me is less about whether this rights framework is the correct framework or not, because at the end of the day, we need the reason our system is functional. We can argue about whether or not it works, but it is functional in some degree. It is governing our lives. It's because it has certain constraints, and we have a system for adjudicating how those constraints are or are not limiting government action. And I think that to me, the problem is not in judicial review. To me, the problem is in a myth that we all, or many, kind of purport to adhere to, which is that courts are not political. And it's just reality proves time and time and time again that courts are very political. And and the Supreme Court, of course, is the most political, perhaps one of the most political bodies we have. And yet we keep coming, every time it acts in a political way, in a blatantly political way, people are up in arms. And whenever there's a decision that's a right-centered decision, people on the left or on the right, one group is going to be very, very upset. And so I think, to me, the reform that has made the most sense is, and court packing, of course, like you said, it's not a solution, because it just, it's a path towards nothingness. I mean, you just end up having a court of 100 or 200 judges. It really doesn't solve any problem. So the solution that I've kind of found to be appealing is term limits. And term limits, court judges that serve a maximum of, the terms, but not, terms that are off cycle from the political elections. So it's clear that the president, with the consent of the Senate, has the ability to appoint the justices. So and that was clearly a decision to make it political to some degree. But the problem we have is in the lasting effects of that, so that Donald Trump gets elected, chooses 3 judges, and we're stuck with them for, 3 or 4 generations. And that's where we have the problem. And so it's, to me, the thing that makes sense is say, okay, well, each appointment can last for 6 years or 10 years or 12 years even, whatever, and with a maximum of X number of years. And we as a society decide that, Donald Trump's nominees are only going to, be able to do what they're going to do for X number of years and not for a lifetime. And there's no good reason that they should serve for a lifetime. So I don't know. To me, that's where our problem is. And it's not. And I think judicial review to me seems unavoidable. And I don't know that I have a problem with it.
Let me, if I may, Dr. Jucovy, try to unify some of we just covered so much ground. I want to try to succinctly unify some of the themes here, and also thank you at the same time for doing this. This is, when I first saw the invitation, the concepts that you're raising, as I think I've mentioned to you, the very idea that judicial review itself is something that we should be looking at more seriously as a society is, almost taboo in the upper echelon of the legal profession. So I thank you for this, and also, and I also want to plug libertarianism, and say, look, I think and I don't think we're too far off on this, right? I mean, I think it's bad enough that a fundamental right, let us take a woman's right to choose, that a fundamental right is left in the hands of the legislature. But it's far worse that it is when it is left in the hands of the court, right? Because at least the legislature is elected, and at least the individual has some power to alter the composition of that legislature, right? And so I think when we have what you call fighting it out in the streets, which I took to mean, letting the legislatures do what they're going to do, or letting individuals make their way up through the legislatures, right, and affect the kind of change that individuals who elect them want to see in society. when we have that, that's our purest form of democracy. And the purpose of judicial review is to just call balls and strikes, to paraphrase the Chief Justice, on whatever the legislature's doing. What we're doing today, right, is we're saying that's not the purpose of the judiciary. What we want out of the judiciary is to relieve us of the consequences of having to exist together in a Republican democracy, right? We want the judiciary to say no when the legislature does things that dissatisfy certain political factions. That's just having your cake and eating it too. So, so I too feel like judicial review is an unavoidable reality, but I think the solution is, I think you mentioned this early on, is to just have a little bit more of a concrete set of criteria for evaluating the kinds of people who sit on the highest courts in the land. And to make sure that those people subscribe to a notion of judicial review that is really consistent with what the founders imagined, and which is consistent with not inconveniencing the legislative prerogative. That to me would be the way to do it. And to use one example, I think 3 years after Brown v. Board of Ed comes down, a lesser known decision called Cooper v. Aaron gets handed down. And I believe there the state of Arkansas decided that it wanted a little bit more time to effect the desegregation mandate, and essentially had had state troopers out in order to prevent those desegregating measures. And the court basically said, guess what? We're not giving you that time. You're going to do it now, and you're going to do it because we have spoken and we are the supreme law of the land. And that is obviously not true. And that is not at all the place the judiciary was intended to hold within our constitutional structure. But if the court hadn't done that, of course, then what very likely would have happened is the state troopers were out, Eisenhower would have called in the National Guard, and bullets probably would have flown. And yes, we would have had probably some microcosmic civil war there. But that is the brink on which I think our society is perpetually teetering.
I think that was the decision all 9 justices signed.
That's right. That's unanimous decision that was unanimously wrong as far as the what the conception of
on it too, which I think is really unusual.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. That's my 2 cents there, is that the court has inserted itself. And I think the problem with judicial review is the jurists themselves, right? And frankly, the attitude and often the megalomania that many of them bring to the bench. You know, as I've said, I was fortunate to clerk for 2 judges who aren't that, but there are many who are. And I don't think it's controversial or any stretch to say that. And so when the court perceives itself as the supreme law of the land, there's a serious separation of powers problem that arises, right? And we have yet to fully grapple with that issue, and it's a critical issue to grapple with, right? Within a Republican democracy that, in theory, has 3 co-equal branches of government.
Yeah, and I think I take issue with this idea that in a Republican democracy, the court has some predefined role that is determined by the founders and whose role doesn't evolve. Because the reality of how courts have come to play a role in any political system, and certainly the common law courts and the courts of equity in the UK and then the US, it was a power play, and it was a power struggle that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I don't understand, like, to me, I can't accept that, you know, the courts have some role in our system that was defined by the founders. First of all, I'm not even sure they weren't really defining a role. They were kind of essentially giving effect to a role that already was in place and kind of working it into the political structure they envisioned. But they, you know, it wasn't a radically different role. And it was a role that was at the time an evolving role and continued to evolve and evolved as it has. To me, it's a natural as I say, it's a political organ. It's not distinct from politics. It's not apart from politics. And I don't think the three branches of government are co-equal. There is a power struggle between them. There always has been. There always will be, and that it's a power struggle that is by design. And I kind of embrace the power struggle, and you kind of want, and yeah, I mean, whether they're megalomaniacs or not, I mean, we can discuss that. That's a different issue. But you want people who are going to be assertive and effective, you know, and not just. I don't know. I don't see how courts can just, you know, the reality is, and this, it's true also, you know, not just in our domestic system. It's true in all, I think, in all systems, and it's true. You look at the European Union and the power. Look at what's happening between the EU and the sovereign states of Europe, and there's a power struggle there between the European Court of Justice and the European Commission and the sovereign states of Europe, and so, you know, I think it's just an inevitable feature of having courts and having legislatures and executives, and I don't know, that part to me I embrace. I think the things are, you know, have run amok. I mean, I think we're all on the same page about that. It's a question of how to rein them in and make things work more effectively. John, I think you're speaking, but you're on mute.
Right. So I understand you embracing something. If what you're embracing is the notion that there's a power struggle, that's just a fact. All institutions struggle for power. Do you embrace the result, which is the aggrandizement of the court's power? As you say, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Is that, do you think, the result that you desire, or is it something that you'd like to see modified, reversed?
To me, what's happening in the last 10, well, really since Bush v. Gore, I'd say in the last 20 years, is a diminution of the court's power. Because as a society, we're coming to respect the court less and less. And the court has become a more political, I mean, Bush v. Gore was obviously a very political decision, and clearly the court's stepping over its bounds. And so, and then it's done that a number of times where it's really kind of just, you know, not even tried to pretend it was apolitical. So to me, that's that, you know, the court's going the other direction. And the problem, as I was saying earlier, is in the fact that we have a political process for appointing judges, but then it just goes on and on and on. And that to me is the core of the problem, and part of why the court is, there's kind of this severe disconnect between our the political ups and downs of our society, and then this court that is supposed to be above politics, and we have these justices that are supposed to kind of, you know, be operating under law and not under politics, and yet they're very political, and they stay in their positions for 30, 40 years. And I think that has diminished the role of the court. I mean, at this point, I mean, I know a lot of lawyers who like struggle to even have a respect for law anymore after.
Yeah, but I think that conflates the power of the court with esteem for the court, you know?
Yeah, that's what I think you're talking about two different phenomenon.
Friends,
I think they're very much intertwined.
Justice retires or dies, it gets worse and worse. And I think that's why your idea, I think, is one that ultimately should carry the day of term limits of some degree, just because it's madness. But I think there is this madness because the stakes are so high, because it does remain so powerful.
Right. And you mentioned the European Union, and I really, I think that what's evolved here, certainly in the Western world, the Western democratic world, is an extraordinary democracy deficit. And the term was originally maybe not invented, but certainly used a great deal to describe the way in which the European Union was formed, and lacked a strong amount. It lacked very much legitimacy. And if anything, what the European Court rulings, as well as the rest of the European Union bureaucracy rulings and enactments have done, is played a large role in generating the kind of dangerous, this comes from my values. For those people who agree with some of the movements that have arisen in Europe on the right, they probably think it's a wonderful thing. But I think this is a dangerous phenomenon. And what the courts have done is, I think that they have brought democracy to, I've heard serious thinkers talking about the age of democracy coming to an end. And I think the role of judicial review in bringing it to an end, both practically because judicial review is undemocratic, but also reactively because judicial review has led to growing democracy deficit and resentment. I think it's played a major role in that. And I'm old-fashioned enough to want to see democracy last. I think it's been a nice experiment, and I'd hate to see what's going to take its place. But we're watching it happening all over the Western world.
I wonder if that's where we've ended up here. Is that, and I think that's the question. I think that's sort of coming to the fore. Is there a way back? And I think the answer might be no. And as far as
I think you're right, it might be no.
I think the answer might be no. Yeah, and I don't think term limits does a thing. Aside from, look, if you don't like a particular justice, or you think that they are really, more politically driven than you'd like, or more ideologically driven than you'd like, then I suppose that person can go. But it's not going to stop the cycle. And the cycle has been, and we've seen it, we've covered it now for 3 hours, right? Has been hundreds and hundreds of decisions and decades of the court in one way or another substituting its policy preferences for that of the legislature, right? I mean, one way or another. And I don't know where we are now. That is our view of the judiciary, whether you think that's a view that's consistent with the originalist ideal, whether you think it's evolved into more of a libertarian view. We have decided that the role of the judiciary in our society is to announce rights, is to impose its will on the legislature, and to declare itself the supreme law of the land. And I don't see how that could possibly change at this point. It would require a certain kind of class of individuals to sort of take the bull by the horns, and say, look, we've had enough of this. Those individuals would have to be actually on the bench, right? And I think what you're seeing, an interesting phenomenon we haven't touched on, is you're seeing a lot of those independent thinkers who have been appointed to various courts of appeals and federal courts in general over the last decade or more as young people in their late 30s and early 40s. And you're seeing increasing numbers of them step down from the bench after only a few years, after only about 8, 9, 10 years on the bench. And these are some of the Greg Costa on the Fifth Circuit is one of them. These are some of the individuals who really pressed up against some of these concepts while they were on the bench, to really pen some interesting dissents about whether the court was issuing advisory opinions without realizing it, was treading upon political questions and taking cases that the courts really shouldn't be taking, and claiming that various legislatures were violating principles of separation of powers when the very act of proclaiming that violation is itself arguably a violation of that principle. So it's, courts have become increasingly, less self-aware. And I think this kind of attitude of policy substitution and superimposition of judicial will has become the norm. And it would take certain individuals on those courts to actually butt up against that phenomenon and affect real change. And I'm not sure we have that many individuals serving on courts who are of that mind. And I'm not sure we have many individuals not serving on those courts who are interested in being appointed to those courts, and who would be of that mind. So I'm not sure there is a way back. And I think it is a real threat to what we know today's democracy.
So on a happy note, if there's no way back, at the very least, if there's no way back, we have, there's great television these days. The courts will get to decide everything, lobbying groups, interest groups, not the legislature. And we can be happy in the knowledge that the people who are going to be serving on the courts and making those television programs and working in the lobbying groups are our particular class of people. So at the very least, we'll get to have a say in the fate of society. But I don't know how the rest of the citizenry is going to think about it. Was that a happy note?
Maybe that is what the founders imagined.
Sounded a bit like the protocols of the elders of Zion to me.
I wasn't referring to our group in that way.
Oh boy.
All right, anyone can add their 2 cents in as well, but Alex, when you said we spent the last 3 hours talking about it, for a second I looked at the clock and thought, has it gone on for 3 hours tonight? But no, it didn't. You meant
An aggregated 3 hours, yeah.
An aggregate of 3 hours. You children are going to inherit an interesting world from my generation.
I hope we can keep it, or maybe not anymore. Maybe Franklin was wrong. Maybe we should hope to change it.
Right. All right.
Thank you for putting this together, Doc, and for preparing and engaging the discussion. And I saw you have something slated for May also, which
yeah, it's movies, right?
Yeah, we have, we're going to do some foreign films.
Yeah, be
thanks to Dr.
warned.
Jucovy.
Trigger warning, there are subtitles. And they're movies about, they're not, has nothing to do with my phase in life, but they're movies about old age. But I love them even when I was younger. Watching these 3 movies will, I'm convinced, make you a better human being into your old age even. All right. Good night,
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Have a good
Have
night.
a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom,
Sameach.
and with
Chag
Pesach
Sameach.
on the horizon, a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. It's been wonderful spending the last few Thursdays with you. We look forward to seeing you real soon, hopefully with our program in May. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.